Zhenan Bao is a department chair and K.K. Lee, the professor of chemical engineering, a professor of chemistry and a professor of material science and engineering at Stanford University. Bao founded the Stanford Wearable Electronic Initiative in 2016 and served as a faculty director. Prior to joining Stanford in 2004, she was a distinguished member of technical staff in Bell Lab, Lucent Technology. She received her PhD degree in chemistry from the University of Chicago in 1995. She has published over 500 papers, 65 US patent with a Google Scholar H-index over 160. Bao was selected as Nature's 10 People Who Matters in 2015 as a Master of Materials for her work on artificial electronic skin. Bao is a co-founder and on the board of directors for C3 Nano and Pyra Ames, both are Silicon Valley venture-funded startups. She serves as an advising partner for Fusion Venture Capital. Please welcome Professor Zhenan Bao.
Thanks, Professor Kim, for the very kind invitation and the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be speaking at this symposium, and it was wonderful to hear Younan and John's talk. And it's always very exciting to see all the possible applications for skin interface electronics from John. In my group, we focus on developing organic materials for skin-inspired electronics. This is the outline for my talk. I'm going to start with an introduction on the status of the skin-like electronics, and then I'll give you several examples of where soft electronic interface can play a unique role in implantable electronics. And finally, I'll give a future outlook by giving an example of genetically targeted chemical assembly. We believe stretchable sensors, circuits, and batteries are about to change our relationships with electronics and with each other. This is a comment that we put out in Nature magazine a few years ago. What we envisioned is that we're going beyond the smartphone era. Now we're starting to enter into the enhanced wearables era, and where we see that electronics are started to be worn on our clothes, and next will be on our skin, and eventually will be implanted inside our body. This is going to be how we're going to interface with the electronics around us and how we're going to interface with our environment and the friends. In our case, we use skin as the inspiration to think about how we can design such future electronics. Skin has the sensing functionality combined with signal processing, transmission, and the biointerface. All of these are features that we would like to incorporate into our future electronics. In addition to that, skin is also a wonderful material that combines flexibility, stretchability, biodegradability, and the self-healing all into one single material. There are a number of approaches towards stretchable electronics through development of new materials, also integration of inorganic materials with in between some stretchable interconnects, and also the functionalities for these materials and devices are increasingly improving. For example, sweat sensors that can sense various physiological parameters, as well as ion content and the chemical content, and using the flexible form factor to get better signals and more accurate information. Over the past decade, my group has been developing such materials. Now we have a number of materials ranging from conductors to semiconductors, stretchable, self-healable, and even biodegradable. And all of them can have properties that are on par with those of amorphous silicon, and allowing us to start to make functional devices that are of great interest for different applications. This video here shows what these devices looks like, and you can see we can bend and twist them. The red curve shows the output curve of the electrical current, and the black line is the leakage current. As you can see, even when the device is being poked by a sharp object, the current output is hardly changing, indicating that these skin-like materials can enable very, very robust materials and devices. With the development of the fabrication methods, now we have a number of materials that are available to build circuits and the basic circuit blocks. And here we can have the most basic digital circuit and the analog circuit building blocks that are all fabricated using intrinsically stretchable transistor arrays. We're able to build not only just hundreds of transistors, but rather thousands of transistors. This is a tactile e-skin that has 10 by 10 arrays of transistor plus 10 by 10 tactile sensors that can be used to sense the location of this ladybug leg and give the image of where the legs are located. So the sensing functionality of the skin can be represented by sensing, signal processing, and the neural interface. And this is the basic electronic blocks that we try to mimic in our skin-inspired systems. So here, again, the sensing and the actuation function, these can be made with skin-like materials. And then in the middle, these are data conditioning circuits, and they can be also made of skin-inspired materials, or depending on the system design, they could be part of the data processing component, which is made of microprocessors. And the part that's most desirable to be in direct contact with skin is the sensing and actuation part, which will gain from sensing sensitivity as well as better modulation when it's in direct contact with human body. The kind of stretchable circuit blocks that we're able to fabricate now includes, for example, the amplifiers that can be used to amplify the signal from sensors directly, and that can be potentially integrated with the sensors. And we also have all the basic circuit blocks as shown on the right, including AND gate, NOR gate, the ring oscillators, and amplifiers. These are both the circuit layout and the actual photo of the circuits that we're able to build. One of the advantages of having such stretchable circuits and transistors is that when we build sensors, the sensor output could be potentially maintained to be only sensitive to the external stimuli without being affected by the strain or movement. For example, for stretchable temperature sensor, many of those reported are using resistive sensing, which is both sensitive to temperature as well as to strain or bending or pressure. So in our case, we designed these circuits made of transistors where there is a reference transistor that's incorporated so that the effect from strain or bending or pressure can be subtracted using the simple circuit, so that the circuit output will only be sensitive to temperature and without being sensitive to strain. So on the right in this figure, in the plot, you can see when we vary different strain and the voltage output as a function of temperature is not dependent on the strain at all. So ultimately, when we build wearable electronic systems, the part that's most desirable to be in contact with skin is the sensing part, while the data processing part will still currently be made of microprocessors, which is rigid components. In addition to that, we also need a battery for power, providing the power. So these rigid components will make the wearable system to become rather bulky, and we will not be able to take advantage of the form factor of our stretchable electronics that we can develop. So the concept that we are taking advantage of is similar to those of RFID tag concept. This is what we call the body net. In the body net system, we have the sensor together with the antenna made with entirely stretchable material. And in the future, simple circuit blocks such as amplifiers and ring oscillators can also be built onto these sensing tags to make the sensing tag even more accurate. But the rigid component, as shown here, that contains Bluetooth, battery, and microprocessors can be put onto the reader, and the reader is placed onto the clothing of the person where there's room for such more rigid components, but the reader is placed in close proximity to the sensors so that the information of the sensor can be read by these readers and then sent through the Bluetooth to the central cloud. And in this case, we're able to separate the stretchable component from the rigid component and fully take advantage of the stretchable form factor of our sensor. This demonstration here shows where the user wearing multiple sensors on the arm, on the belly, and on the legs, as well as on the hand, to monitor several different parameters all at the same time, where the readers are all placed onto the clothing. So that in this case, the sensors are basically the form of stickers that can stick anywhere on the body and without imposing any uncomfortableness. And this allows us to be able to sense information more than what a Fitbit can sense, which is just the movement of the person by measuring the number of steps. But here we can measure the details of the movement of each leg or each hand, and the breathing frequency, as well as the heart rate. Of course, in the future, many other sensors can be incorporated into this platform. The body net structure can be designed to be very thin and very small. So here shows a small body net that measures pressure that can be placed onto the wrist to sense the pulse wave, or multiple such sensors can be placed onto one single sheet. And each sensor can be designed to have a different resonance frequency. And then this way we will be able to read out the sensor response simultaneously using the reader reading different frequencies. The body net can also be implanted inside the body. In this case, we wrap around this pressure sensor around the artery, and the antenna is being placed under the skin. So this way, the reader can read through the skin, even though there is some signal attenuation by the tissue. But under the skin, still, it's possible to read out the signal through the skin. And here we show that it's possible to monitor the blood vessel, whether the blood vessel is clogged, using this kind of wireless implantable sensor. Here, the demonstration shows when the artery is blocked, then you can see the signal decrease significantly, while when it's unclogged, then we can detect the pulse from the blood flow again. And this is designed to be also a biodegradable sensor, so that after the initial monitoring, the sensor can degrade over time without having another surgery. Next, I would like to talk about the biointerface aspect after the above quick overview of the status of the skin-inspired electronics in general. The examples I want to give here are some examples where we see the skin-like form factor can play a unique role that conventional rigid electronics are not going to be able to realize. So for implantable electronics, there are a number of potential mismatches between conventional rigid electronics and the soft tissue. One is the modulus mismatch and the bending stiffness of the rigid electronics. Certainly, rigid electronics can be potentially reduced in thickness and then make them to have lower bending stiffness. However, the high modulus, especially at the edges of such electronics, can potentially still cause damage to the tissue because of the movement of tissue over time. The areas we see in particular, the skin-inspired electronics can play really unique roles are areas where the dynamic movement or changing in size in the tissue may be involved for the particular application. But the advantage for conducting material-based interface is not only the softness of such electronics and the low modulus, but in addition to that, in recent years, it have been recognized by a number of groups that the combination of both ion transport and electron transport in conducting polymer matrix, where we have both conducting polymer as well as ionic conducting component, that leads to lower biointerfacial impedance when such electrodes is in contact with tissue. So here, this plot is from work by David Martin's group, where they coated metal electrodes with conducting polymer interface, and they show the impedance measured between the electrode and the tissue is decreased by several orders of magnitude. And this decreased impedance at the interface is very important because that reduces the voltage that's needed to either stimulate the tissue or to, when measuring electrical information from the tissue, this would increase the signal to noise issue. The challenge so far for making such kind of interface is that having both low modulus and high conductivity at the same time has been a big challenge. And conducting hydrogel is ideal for this case because it combines conductivity, electrical conductivity, ion conductivity, as well as the low modulus into one material. And what we need in terms of softness and conductivity is on this diagonal line, and the higher the conductivity and also high softness is what we need. But the previous approach typically involves mixing the conducting component with a soft hydrogel component that usually results in low conductivity, even though the softness can be improved, but it cannot achieve the conductivity that's needed. In more recent years, through the understanding of the interaction between the conducting components and the ionic components in these conducting polymer, we have ways now to tune to achieve both high conductivity as well as low modulus in the material. So the conducting polymer P-dot PSS is typically made with conducting polymer P-dot, which is represented by these red lines, stabilized by charged PSS that's surrounding the conducting polymer, so that the conducting polymer will not aggregate and precipitate. As a result, the conduction is being limited because there is limited connection between these colloid particles where the conducting components is surrounded by the PSS insulating components. However, in recent years, others and our study have shown that by tuning the ionic strength of this solution, one can induce the gel phase formation in these systems. And by choosing the right ionic species that's incorporated into the solution, one can induce the pi-pi interaction between the electrically conducting components, and induce a better interconnection also between these aggregates to achieve high conductivity hydrogels. For example, this is one of the highest conductivity stretchable PDOT that we have reported previously. In this case, the addition of ionic liquid that contains Ni that also serves as a dopant for the conducting polymer can change the morphology of the original film before the addition of this ionic species. In the original film, the conducting part is stabilized by the PSS and forms these kinds of nodule-like morphology where the conducting polymer is not interconnected. But with the addition of the ionic liquid, we induce aggregation of the conducting polymer that's being seen as the nanofibers that's shown here and in the AFM. And at the same time, the ionic liquid can dope the conducting polymer to increase the conductivity, as well as plasticizing the PSS component so that the entire polymer becomes highly stretchable. The conductivity of such a film can reach as high as 4,000 Siemens per centimeter at 100% strain. This is among the highest conductivity value, even for non-stretchable conducting polymer. But in this case, it's achieved for 100% strain. So it's a very remarkable value. Using this kind of ionic liquid, stable kind of modified hydrogel, then we are able to increase the connectivity between the PDOT component. The student in the group came up with a modified method to taking advantage of this hydrogel and being able to make it into a biocompatible hydrogel. So the ionic liquid, since it's not biocompatible, it's first used to induce the high conductivity, and then the ionic liquid is removed and the film is dried, but the PDOT network is being formed because of the ionic liquid. And then after the film is dried, this film can undergo any patterning, lithography and etching using traditional patterning method. And then this material after patterning can again be exposed to water and allow the material to get rehydrated. And here from this video, you can see the side view of the film after hydration. It will increase thickness by 6 times, and then this great increase in the absorption of water result in a conducting hydrogel that has tissue-like modulus on the order of a few tenths of kilopascal. But at the same time, the conductivity remains high because the conducting component is still interconnected. As mentioned earlier, this kind of hydrogel can be patterned using conventional patterning method, using lithography and etching. So here we can obtain fine patterns. For example, this one shown here, even down to micron feature size. As I mentioned earlier, the advantage of such conducting polymer-based hydrogel is its low interfacial impedance when in contact with tissue. So here we can compare the impedance of such material, which is the conducting hydrogel is called MECH. It has the lowest impedance while compared to metal-based platinum electrode or pure ionic conductor, which is DMEM here, and the dual conductor of both electrical and ionic conductor shows the lowest conductivity. And the advantage for this is shown on the right. This shows the current density that can be put out if we use such electrodes to inject charges. The current density that can be injected is orders of magnitude higher compared to that of platinum electrode or that made with ionic conductors. The advantage of this kind of electrode is that when we use that for stimulating nerves, for example, here we are stimulating the sciatic nerve of a mouse to obtain the same leg movement using this kind of conducting polymer hydrogel. We can use basically around 50 millivolts is sufficient because it puts out a very high current even at low voltage. But if we use a metal, conventional metal electrode, we needed to use 10 times higher voltage in order to obtain the same amount of leg movement. So the lower the voltage, the least likely for damaging of the tissue, and as a result, can give a more biocompatible implant for nerve stimulation. One of the great applications for the high-density patterned electrode arrays is to take advantage of their high-density mapping on the beating heart so that the stretchable electrodes can conform to the beating heart and move with the heart expanding and contract without being damaged and still being able to map the signal with high fidelity. John Rogers' group has done this already a few years ago, but ex vivo on the heart. And in this case, we performed the measurement in vivo on pig's heart. And this is showing the electrode array with 100 micron resolution for the electrodes compared to the previous one was 3.5 millimeter. The next example I want to show is to address a challenge that cannot be solved using currently available device form factor. For infants to children, adolescents, and finally adults, our body size and organ grow and increase in size dramatically. Existing implantable bioelectronics do not accommodate such developmental tissue growth. For example, a vagus nerve stimulator was implanted when the patient was young. After years of constraint, the nerve is severely compressed. Some young patients has to go through multiple invasive correction surgery during their lifetime to replace such rigid device. A new type of implantable electronics, for which we give its name Morphine electronics or Morph-E, that grows with expanding tissue or organ without causing any mechanical constraints. Other than the electronics requirements, we will want our implantable to assert almost no force, that is, no constraint at all, when the material is under extremely slow strain rate, similar to the case of tissue growth rate. On the other hand, the electronics needs to stay tightly wrapped around the organ despite any body movement. Therefore, under a faster strain rate, the material should behave elastically. As seen in this photo and the plot, the length of the electronics would not shrink even days or months after strain is removed. Their stress strain curve are shown on the left and indeed represent the behavior of what we hope to achieve. The chemistry that enabled Morphine electronics is again the non-covalent dynamic polymer network. Here, the substrate material is made with PDMS with an appropriate ratio of high association constant MPU units and the low association constant IU units. We previously have discovered that such a material can readily bond with each other even in presence of water. It greatly simplifies our fabrication process as we can simply stack each layer containing different sensors and electronics on top of each other. PDMS is also well-known biocompatible material, making it an ideal material for substrate and encapsulation material. The strain sensor and the neural stimulation electrodes are both made of conducting polymer PDOT. Its mechanical property can be tuned with glycerol, again, another biocompatible chemical which induces nanofiber formation in the conducting polymer. Morphine was implanted into adolescent rat for up to 8 weeks. During this time, the diameter of the nerve where the implant was made is at least doubled. As can be seen from the left side, after wrapping the stimulator around the nerve with gentle pressing, the stimulator immediately forms a good tight contact with the nerve. After implanted for 4 weeks, we can see that the Morphine electronics stays in good conformal tight contact with the nerve. On the contrary, the standard nerve cuff currently used in clinic is made with rigid plastic. Even though it has an opening to accommodate some degree of change in size, it could not stay in place due to the growth of the nerve and caused severe damage to the nerve. To further determine whether and how Morphine impact the growing rat, we investigated gait, which is locomotion of rat limb, and the behavior changes. Rats implanted with Morphine showed normal gait, with their walking observed with normal paw placement, and toes are naturally spread. However, the rats with implanted cuff electrodes experienced abnormal paw function with whole foot placement on the ground and the dragging of their toes. This is a typical symptom of serious sciatic nerve dysfunction. A series of motor tests were done, shown in the lower figure. Even after 8 weeks of implantation, Morphine rats retained natural motion function, where various cuff electrode implanted rats suffer from permanently reduced motor responses. The controls are rats with the surgery, but no implants, called sham control in the lower figure. The last example I want to give is a piece of recent published work with Carl Desroff on genetically targeted chemical assembly. One of the questions we have been asking ourselves when we started working with eSkin is how do we connect the sensor outputs with specific sensory nerves? How do we specifically control the stimulation of particular motor nerves to control muscle movement? On the other hand, the high level of structural and functional complexities in multicellular living systems remains beyond the reach of human design and assembly capabilities. If we're able to mimic the capabilities of cells in living organisms to recruit specific chemical building blocks to construct synthetic materials in vivo, and even to assemble complex functional structures in vivo. It will open up many new possibilities to truly merge electronics with living organisms for treatment of chronic diseases. Genetic targeting offers a way to specifically target certain cell types. For example, optogenetics, pioneered by my colleague Carl Desroff, allows specific targeting of specific neurons in the brain so that they become sensitive to light stimulation. Using genetic targeting, specific cell type can be functionalized with an oxidative enzyme, so-called APEX2 here. In presence of aniline dimer and a monomer and a dilute hydrogen peroxide solution, oxidative polymerization of aniline is triggered, and the deposition of polyaniline occurs on APEX2-coded neurons. It can be seen from the right side. The control cells without APEX2 did not have any polyaniline deposition under similar chemical conditions, while the cells targeted with APEX2 showed clear polyaniline deposition. Interestingly, the neuron cells coated with conducting polyaniline showed decreased firing rate, while when they are coated with an insulating polymer, PDAP, the firing rate increased. This suggests that we may be able to selectively stimulate specific type of neurons. We now have shown that we can deposit polyaniline onto specific neuron cells in brain slice and in living organism. When conducting polymer is deposited on the excitatory motor neurons of C. elegans, a small worm, we observed its movement has been reduced, as indicated by the bar graph on the right, which shows more orange color. This means a higher number of paralyzed worms. We're very excited about the future opportunities that genetically targeted chemical assembly can bring. I believe it allows us to ultimately to merge electronics with biological systems. In summary, here I've talked about some examples of our skin-inspired electronics, and in particular, the unique applications such electronics can enable. And we see a bright future of using skin-inspired materials and sensors for the future generation of implantable and wearable. We do believe stretchable sensors, circuits, and batteries are about to change our relationships with electronics and with each other. Finally, I'd like to thank my research group, the students and postdocs, for their creative and hard work that took us from the initial exploration to where we are currently. And I very much look forward to where we can go from here in the future. I thank the funding agencies for their support and many collaborators for the collaboration and inspirations over the years. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhenan Bao, for the excellent presentation. Then we have several questions. So first question, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I have two questions. Are the skin-attached sensors waterproof, or do you require additional coatings on the sensors to make them waterproof? Second question, there would be wires required for the body implanted device for electronic connections. What materials are the wire and coils made of? I believe they cannot be made of copper.
So first, for the question related to whether the sensors are waterproof, in the case of implantable devices, we developed encapsulation material. These are either fluorinated elastomer or for shorter term implantation, we found simple SEBS insulating elastomer seem to be sufficient. And also for the implantable, we have been mostly working with PDOT-based conducting hydrogel. So in that case, the hydrogel already contained water to begin with, and the encapsulation was mainly to reduce the crosstalk between the sensing electrodes and also stimulation electrodes. So the requirement for waterproofing is not that significant. For electronic circuits, certainly encapsulation to prevent water diffusion will be necessary. And I think development of encapsulation layer that can prevent water and the moisture diffusion would be a very important area for research. Just now, John mentioned that developing stretchable battery or skin-like battery will be an important direction. And certainly for that type of application, good encapsulation material actually might be the key to enable that. The second question is related to wiring of the devices. And wiring indeed can be very challenging, especially to interface the skin-like sensors with rigid electronics. And in that case, we have been using stretchable kind of interconnects, and where we have to develop the interface between the rigid and the soft electronics. And so far, that's still under development. Frequently, we find the failure may happen at those interfaces. So that's why we think that the body net type of kind of system where we separate the sensors and the rigid electronics using wireless communication might be, at least in the near term, more suitable for the applications of these devices.
Thank you for your kind answer. And next question, can the skin patch cause discomfort to the wearer over a long period of continued use? What are some design, the principle?
Can the skin patch decompose? Is that the question?
Yes, sometimes it causes the discomfort to the wearer over a long period of continued use. So what are some design principles you have considered to reduce them?
Okay. We haven't spent too much time in thinking about the long-term degradation to the these wearable electronics. For materials development, we usually test the material for multiple stress strain cycles, some thousands of cycles, some 10,000 cycles or more. But then in the integrated systems, we have not gone through extensive testing. Certainly the adhesion at interface will play a very important role, even if individual material is stable. So I would say that really paying attention to the interface would be very important, in addition to ensuring the materials themselves are stable under strain and compression.
Thank you for your answer. Then another question is the PDOT PSS is known to be less durable when coated on surface of metal. Then it seems difficult to be applied for chronic use when implanted into the body. Is there any method to improve the adhesion between PEDOT, PSS, and metal?
Well, for PEDOT PSS, if one uses the commercial available PEDOT PSS, then even though the PEDOT is insoluble in water, but due to its morphology, I mentioned that it has the stabilization by the PSS, so it forms this kind of granular type of morphology, makes it quite unstable. It falls apart in solution over long term, and also adhesion to different surfaces is not good. But through tuning the ionic strengths, one can induce physical cross-linking between the PEDOT molecules, and that stabilize the PEDOT film. And the adhesion aspects can be improved by incorporating into the hydrogel molecules that can promote adhesion. There have been a number of reports recently. I think Xuanhe Zhao's group has published a PEDOT adhesive that works pretty well, and that general strategy, I think, of incorporating other adhesion molecules to promote interface bonding would be a good strategy for PEDOT.
Thank you. And could you please comment on the lifetime of the e-skin device?
It really depends on which type of e-skin. In general, if for wearing outside the body and not talking about the mechanical or the wear and tear, just the chemical stability, I would say these materials and devices are very stable, especially with a thin layer of encapsulation. Now the semiconductors we use, the most high mobility, the highest mobility ones tend to be the conjugated polymer SEBS blend, and they are very, very stable in air because of the hydrophobic nature of the SEBS, help to prevent water absorption and also partially encapsulate the semiconductor. And for the electrodes, for building circuits, we normally use carbon nanotubes. So they are also very stable. And finally, with a little bit encapsulation, these devices can last for quite a long time.
Thank you, Professor Bao. And this will be the last question. With regard to the device that should grow with a growing human body, could foldable the microstructures that open up as the body grows be utilized?
I didn't quite understand the question. Can you repeat?
So sometimes our human body grows, right? Then also when we attach the device, then it will affect some sort of the adhesion or some other the device operation. So can you solve this?
Well, the design for our Morphine electronics is so that it will conform very well to the nerve or to the tissue to begin with. So we since the material, even if you stretch it to make conformal contact, it will not assert a lot of force. So as the nerve continues to grow, it will continue to maintain that good conformal contact. But the material is also designed to be elastic at high strain rate, so that if there's movement, then the material will return back to its original shape if it's fast movement. But very, very slow growth rate will not cause the device to detach from the tissue.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Zhenan Bao, for your great talk and excellent contribution to our symposium.
Thank you.